It's a pleasure to be here. This is I think I've been here 3 or 4 times giving these lectures, and Elizabeth keeps inviting me back, and the park keeps having me back. So they must like me, must be doing something right, but it's absolutely one of my favorite places to talk because I know you all love the islands as much as I do, and they're really a magical place. And I want to thank the park for their support of my research, Laura, Ann, and everybody at the park. What I do, I can't do without the help of a lot of people and a lot of work at the park. So I can't say enough about what the park adds to our knowledge and the work that we do every day. So today I'm going to talk about this 10-year project. I gave a talk about this topic 5 or 6 years ago, I think, and we were just in the midst of it, and I finally wrapped everything up, and I think Laura summed it up pretty well for you. I'm going to sort of take you through a narrative about the rise of commercial abalone fishing and the central role that the Channel Islands played in helping us better understand that, the eventual collapse of commercial abalone fishing in California, and then maybe what we can learn from archaeology about restoring impacted and degraded marine ecosystems. A work that I call historical ecology and archaeologists call historical ecology. So if you're like me, I started out on the parks and working on the parks focused on the deep history of the island, so the deep human history of the island. So I was really focused in on the Chumash records and stuff like this, and that I'm sure you're all familiar with Arlington Springs, 13,000 years of human history. I mean, the islands hold this really deep human history that's just fantastic. John Johnson here doing some work, reanalysis of this Arlington Springs human remains that Phil Orr first found and excavated. And then this incredible Chumash history on the islands that extends for at least 13,000 years up to historical contact of evolution of Chumash society, their development of a complex trade system, bead money making, maritime hunting and gathering technologies, just really incredible. And this is what I was focused on. And for the most part, this is what a lot of Channel Islands archaeologists working in the park had been focused on for a very long time. And then you probably are also all familiar with some of these stories. After the Chumash abandoned or were removed from the islands, the history of the ranching period on the island, which is this really rich, interesting history that really transformed island land and seascapes. Here's the Lester family and their ranch on San Miguel Island, and there's great books and stuff available on this. Some of the stories you may not be familiar with are part of the islands, but they're not terribly well known. So this is a picture from Islepedia. If you should go check out this website if you don't know about it. Marla Daly put this all together, and it's just this fantastic resource on the history, natural and cultural of the islands. One of the places that we can really understand the rise of commercial abalone fishing and how it became so important in California comes from the islands, and from this being from Santa Cruz Island in the early 20th century. And this history is a history started by Chinese immigrants. The first commercial abalone fisheries began with Chinese immigrants as they came to California. And you're probably all familiar with Chinese immigration into California with these really familiar stories of railroad labor and emblematic families that you can read about in 19th century California, Chinese laundries, gold mining, but they were also, and they left a record of the first commercial fisheries, abalone fisheries on the Channel Islands. And one of the reasons that many prehistoric archaeologists perhaps weren't as interested in this history. And there's some notable exceptions, and I should say Don Morris, former park archaeologist, did some work on this. Mike Glassow at UC Santa Barbara did a little bit of work on these sites. But for the most part, they were passed over by most Channel Islands archaeologists. And that's because this is a really good picture, but they are some of the most uninteresting sites on the island at first glance, right? And that's because they're just these piles of large, whole and broken black abalone shells. And for the most part, nothing else, right? And so when you have this rich Chumash record on the island, and there's sites all over these islands, it's kind of easy to move on and focus on the ancient history of the islands. But these, starting with my dissertation work, I started this work in 2007, and I started to really think about these sites as I was finding them as part of surveys along the coastline of San Miguel Island, and started to recognize that this was a really important part of Channel Islands history and California history that I didn't know much about, and I don't think most people knew much about, and they deserved some specific attention on what these are. So I'm going to take you through this narrative, this story about how these sites came to be, how this commercial fishery came to be, the sort of devastating history of its collapse, and then what we can learn about it. Learn about marine resources and potentially restoring this fishery as we move forward. There we go. Okay. So a number of events occurred to make this commercial fishery happen. So a number of different events had to sort of occur right at the same time. And the first was the dawn of the mission period in California. And you all know with the first contact with Cabrillo in 1542, and then missionization of California, this devastated traditional Native American lifeways. This was the story in Santa Barbara County, in Ventura, on the Channel Islands. And so with the mission period, many of Native Americans were moved into these mission agrarian economies. They abandoned traditional hunting and gathering lifeways. And on the Channel Islands, like all the Channel Islands, were abandoned forcibly, and because those systems were no longer viable after Spanish arrival due to disease and incursion and the development of these agrarian economies. At about the same time, as this was occurring, we also had the rise of fur hunting happening along the Pacific coast. So at the same time the Chumash were being removed from the islands became centers, and the Pacific coast became a center of sea otter hunting as part of the fur trade. And essentially taking out the two primary predators of abalone, right? Humans, the Chumash, Native American communities, and otters, who eat 25% or so of their body weight every day, and one of their choicest, one of their preferred foods are abalone. So you take away the two primary predators of abalone. The 18th and 19th century, this can be described as the sea of slaughter. So it was not just sea otters, but it was lots of sea mammals, whales, and again, this sort of rampant hunting period. So just to give you some idea of the scale of this, it's really hard to know how many otters were taken off the Pacific coast at this time, were hunted, were captured. Estimates between 1742 and 1910 are somewhere around 500,000 to 900,000 otters, right? Driven to the brink of extinction. And this was to feed a rampant fur trade, right? These pelts, otter pelts, became really valuable. One good otter pelt would equal about 10 good beaver pelts, right? So there were just these really luscious furs, and they were highly sought after in places like Canton, and they were shipped around the world. And one thing that we would think would happen is as otters disappeared, right, as pelts became harder to find, people would just abandon that, right? No, well, actually what happens is as these pelts, as otters disappear, those pelts just become more and more valuable. So people pay more and more money for them. And so, in fact, as the population declined, the race to get the last of the otters was on, right? And so it just virtually annihilated otters out of Pacific Coast ecosystems. So one of the things then that happened, this sort of confluence of events resulted in the absolute explosion of abalone in intertidal systems. I'm going to concentrate on black abalone to begin with because that's where our commercial hunting story or commercial fishing story starts. Black abalone are an intertidal species. They're really easy to see. You walk out at low tide and abalone or black abalone are growing on the rocks. Other species are subtidal and harder to see, right, from the shore. But you can see these are pictures from Santa Cruz Island. Abalone just became exceptionally abundant, growing one on top of the other in these intertidal systems because essentially there was no predation, right, with this disruption of Native American economies and the wiping out of abalone. So right at the same time this was all going on, or right after it, we had at Sutter's Mill the discovery of gold in 1848, right? And that launched California into the gold rush. And so, like lots of immigrant communities, Chinese immigrants were one group that flooded to California, into San Francisco to seek their riches in the California gold rush. So just again, to give you a little scale, over 100,000 Chinese immigrants to California between 1848 and 1876, right? So this flood of immigrants, like the immigrants from around the world, were flooding to California as this story of Gold Mountain, of riches to be had. All you had to do was walk into the Sierra Nevadas and strike your fortune, right? Initially, the Chinese immigrants were welcomed, for the most part, like any other immigrant group, right? So everyone was flooded into California. They were going after this gold rush economy, and the Chinese were just another group entering California to engage in the gold economy. Well, it didn't take long for the easy gold to disappear in the Sierra Nevadas, right? And you probably all heard this. And the result of that is the daily wage, how much money people could make, how much gold they could find, precipitously declined, right? So wages, daily wages go from $20, $15 early in the gold rush to a steep decline. And so while all these immigrant groups tended to get along, tended to engage in this economy together, it didn't take long for Chinese groups to be targeted as stealing the gold of California, stealing the gold of the United States, the wealth of this country, and shipping it overseas to their families in China. And laws became passed. One example, in 1850, the Foreign Miners License Law imposed a $20 tax per month on all foreign miners. Essentially, identifying who was foreign was a lot easier if that foreign group was Chinese or other Asian descent rather than from some European country, right? So this became a law that targeted Chinese immigrants. And so Chinese immigrants were pushed to the margins. So that's those stories you hear of Chinese laundries and Chinese restaurants happening at this time is as Chinese immigrants left the gold rush or couldn't make a living in the gold rush, they started to work in these sort of fringes of the California economy. And one of those fringes where they found untapped resources and untapped opportunities was along the coast. So very famously, Chinese immigrants, many of whom came from a coastal province in China, who had skills as fishermen in their home countries and as agriculturalists, but they had the know-how to access these coastal resources. So Here's a picture of a squid camp in Monterey, California. Other examples are the shrimp fishery in Sacramento Bay. And so they started to tap these unrealized resources along the coast, where California was really, much of California was focused on the mountains and the money to be made in the gold rush. And so part of this coastal economy was accessing these untapped and really rich abalone resources that were readily available in the intertidal. So around the first newspaper accounts we have of commercial abalone fishing by Chinese immigrants comes from Monterey in the early 1850s, and the Channel Islands by 1856, I think is the first newspaper account. So in the early to mid 1850s, we see the first account. Here's one of the early accounts, this one from the Los Angeles Star. The extent of and importance of our coast fisheries are not, we think, generally known or appreciated. A very large business is being carried on in this department along the coast and the islands in the channel, from Santa Barbara down. We are not agreeably surprised to find the number of men and vessels engaged in our fisheries, as well as the capital expended in fitting out the same. Chinese fishermen are taking a large quantity of abalones. All right. Much of the record of this earliest commercial fishery on the mainland, because of strip malls, because of development, because of housing, the ravages of time, has been largely wiped out. But on the Channel Islands, where we've protected cultural resources and protected archaeological sites, we have the record of this first or initial, the beginnings of this commercial abalone fishing. And so these are some of the sites. So now you're getting a better idea, because these are more, I really worked hard to get a really nice picture on that first one, but this is what they look like, right? Black abalones sort of embedded in the supertidal or the right along rocky points along the coast, where abalone would have been readily available, and there are just these piles of black abalone shell. I'll tell you what, as an archaeologist, they're the easiest sites to analyze, because they end up being like 99% black abalone, right? And so what these seem to be, they're thin layers, mostly black abalones, and they seem to be logistical, relatively short-term, specialized foraging camps. These were the places that Chinese immigrants came to collect abalone, shuck them, put the shells, throw the shells in pile, and then ship the meat off the island. And you do that from one rocky point to the next along the islands. And so many of these sites were never recorded when I started doing this work in 2007. Again, just not the focus of many archaeologists on the Channel Islands, despite the fact that they're probably, even though they're some of the youngest sites on the island, they're some of the most endangered, right? Many of these sites are just absolutely getting hammered. When storm surges come in, they're just right in the right places to be that see continual erosion and take the brunt of coastal erosion year after year. So many of them are, less than 100. They're all less than 150 years old, but they're some of the most endangered sites on the island. And so myself and a number of colleagues and partners began coastal surveys around Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, San Miguel. There are newspaper accounts that Chinese abalone fishermen were on Anacapa. More work has been done on the southern Channel Islands, but we looked on Anacapa. There's no Chinese sites left. They're just not there anymore. They're probably eroded out. And we've begun this coastal survey to identify these sites. Santa Cruz, we still got a lot of work to do, but the other islands, we've done these coastal surveys to identify these thin logistical foraging sites that many folks just bypassed or overlooked through the years. While I just told you many of these sites are really not terribly interesting, I find them to be really interesting, but they might not be terribly interesting to the casual observer. Some of them seem to be different than these logistical sites that I showed you. So a few sites, what we find are materials like these, artifacts like these, the broken remains. It's a reconstructed pot. Obviously, I put this together. Well, my students have put this together from a site we were working at. This is a brown stoneware pottery. This is emblematic of the mid-19th century Chinese abalone sites, or Chinese occupations on the islands and elsewhere in the American West. And these contained foods that Chinese fishermen were bringing to the islands with them, like pickled vegetables, and there are other forms that hold soy sauce and wine bottles. These were imported from China and packed and brought out to the island. So we know that, again, a nice sort of marker of a Chinese occupation. We also see interesting artifacts like bottles that we can date, that we know within a couple years when this site was occupied. Again, these mid-19th to late 19th century, probably Chinese abalone fishing sites. And then this is something I stole off the internet, so we didn't find this, but we did find this, right? And this is basically the top to an opium lamp, right? So again, telling us about Chinese occupations on the island, fishermen bringing with them opium lamps, and as they used on the mainland at times and places, bringing those things to the island too. I think this is the only example, this is from southern Santa Rosa, only example of opium glass found on all of the northern islands. Really cool stuff. And then really kind of strange stuff too. From another historical site, these are stellar sea lion teeth. These are whole. These are obviously cut. These are cut again. So this is sort of the one side shaved down, both sides shaved down in what we would call blanks, and then carved into ivory rings. So you can imagine these Chinese immigrants out on the islands fishing for abalone and spending their evenings whittling away, perhaps, creating these ivory rings. You can kind of see here, we think these were discarded because they dried out and cracked, and then they were discarded later. Right? So sort of giving us some window into sort of their lifeways on the islands. All right, so what were they doing out there? Well, one of the really cool things about historical archaeology, and perhaps I didn't appreciate when I set out to do mostly prehistoric or ancient archaeology, was this rich historical record that we can mine for clues about, to tell us sort of details that we might not be able to gather from the archaeological record. So here from the San Diego Union, 1871, the abalone is found attached to rocks in an extreme low tide in greater quantities than any other time. The fish, covered by dense shell, adheres to the rock as tightly as if glued to it and is cut loose with a sharp implement. After filling a large bag with meat, which is removed from the shell, it is carried to a place chosen to dry it, and it receives a good pounding. After this beating, the meat is thrown into large kettles and boiled for a short time, then is spread out to dry in the sun. After a thorough drying, it is nicely packed in strong sacks and shipped to San Diego or Santa Barbara to be reshipped from there to Chinese merchants in San Francisco. The meat commands in that city from 5 to 6 cents per pound and is used exclusively by the Chinese. A considerable quantity is shipped to China, where it is regarded as a great luxury, being only used by the better class of people in that country. So this kind of gives us some details about why we might find lots of sites with just black abalone shells and a few sites with something more. All right? So let's go to one of those sites. So this is one of my favorite spots on all the islands. This is Point Bennett at western San Miguel Island. And along the beaches, there is a historical Chinese abalone component where we see features, rock features, and a pavement of abalone. Sort of, they're really cool. It's just this pavement of abalone along the ground, and they're polished on the top of them. And it's basically sea mammals are smushing those down into the soil, and as their big bellies rub over them, they're polishing the top of them as they go from the beaches to the sea every day. So a site that's being, and you can kind of see some of them here. The site's here, and they'll move right back over here when they're done for the evening, basking in the sun when it's sunny out there, right? So what are these rock features? Well, it seems that some of the sites are set up as longer-term occupations for Chinese fishermen. So here another newspaper account. This is from the Daily Independent in Santa Barbara. Parties of Chinese fishermen were on the various Channel Islands most of the year. Rogers and Brothers of the city set out today for San Miguel, a party of 5 men for abalone, seal skins, and oil. The number of abalone to be obtained by such a party is impossible to estimate. Low tide being the only time when they can be gathered, and the lower the tide, the more exposed the view. And you can see it comes along with this historical photo. And so what these seem to be are places where you have big boiling vats to boil those abalone. You pound it out, you boil it, you lay it out to dry, you pack it in sacks, and then you got to get it back to Santa Barbara, then to be shipped up to San Francisco, and then shipped onto China to feed this market for abalone in China. So these are the rock bases for these boiling vats. And you're not going to move this around the island, right? So you go logistically forage abalone, bring it back to what we would call a central location for this final processing. So you're dropped off in this place with everything you need, your boiling vats, you create your infrastructure, and then harvest the islands, harvest the rocky intertidal around the islands. And this was a part of making these rock, what are called, we call these horseshoe or hairpin shaped hearths. We find these in Chinese mining camps as well. So here's one right back there. Can you see that red circle that is back there? So this is part of how Chinese immigrants at this time made hearths, right, and constructed these hearths. So it wasn't just on the island, it was on the mainland in other contexts as well. And so this idea that, often we hear about Chinese immigrants as they were isolated, they were living in California at this time in the mid-19th century as sort of an isolated ethnic group in Chinatowns, and only interacting or not acculturating in California. And that just beguiles what we see with this commercial industry. So here, looking at, we can get this from Fish and Fisheries reports, historical Fish and Fisheries reports, this from 1888. This is an example of the abalone harvested in Santa Barbara that probably came from the Northern Channel Islands. 100,000 pounds of meat valued at $5,000 in 1879, 500,000 pounds of shell. So it wasn't just, it started off as an industry for the meat, then the shell became valuable too, and it became shipped off the islands as well, so the meat and the shells. And again, some more examples of this. Chinese immigrants not only had to harvest this material, had to know how to see the untapped potential of this resource, but they had to set up operations, set up the system to ship it off the island, to get it up to San Francisco and ship it on to China. Some of it was consumed locally by Asian communities in Chinatowns mostly, but a lot of that was being shipped overseas. Many of those people helping with that network, that exchange network, that shipping network, were Euro-American schooners, right? And so they were tapped into sort of the California larger economy to make this all work. So this idea that they were sort of marginal or on the edges or fringes, perhaps that is true in terms of the anti-Chinese sentiment that was going on at the time, but it certainly wasn't true in their ability to negotiate these economic relationships in California. So by the late 1870s, abalone, it's a slow-growing mollusk, readily available in the intertidal. They start to become heavily exploited by Chinese fishermen. And so not only were they moving around the islands to harvest, but they started to move up and down the California coast from central and southern California down into Baja. Here's some abalone drying racks. We find the remnants of these drying racks on the Channel Islands as well. These are not very photogenic, but again, these are so bear with me here. But these are wooden stakes that are carved into points, and probably were the bases of these drying racks that were constructed for that whole process that I read you, that drying process to pare down the weight of abalone it was being shipped off the islands. So the Chinese dominance of this industry was really, I mean, it was secure from the 1850s and 1860s, but by the 1870s, things became untenable for Chinese immigrants in this commercial fishery. And this was because we solved two big problems, right? So in the 1860s, we solved two major problems that should have been a boon for California. One was the ending of the Civil War in 1865, and the other was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Well, what this essentially did was the opposite of what Californians thought it would do. The linking up the Transcontinental Railroad what Californians thought was it was going to move lots of our products over to the East Coast very easily. And it could do that, but the problem was those products could be made more efficiently and more cheaply in longer-lived East Coast factories. And so cheap products started to flood into California. And as the Civil War ended, you had lots of soldiers without jobs. And those soldiers then, where prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, it was this arduous overland route into California, or this long, dangerous ship ride to the West Coast. With the Transcontinental Railroad, you can get people out in just a few days. And so you have this flood of labor. And so with that flood of labor, with the drying up of gold, with the completion of the railroad, anti-Chinese movement went into full force. Probably the person most associated with this was Dennis Kearney. He was an Irish immigrant. He was a failed gold miner, and he founded in 1877 the Working Men's Party. And their platform was immigrants like the Chinese were ruining the country. They were working for cheap labor. They were shipping the wealth of our nation over to China, and he took to ending many of his speeches around California and around the United States, this speech of hate with "the Chinese must go," right? And this brought anti-Chinese movement to a fever pitch. And the Working Men's Party was highly successful. People were economy was bad. People were disillusioned all over the country. They wanted someone to blame, and it's really easy to blame people that don't look like you, right? And that seem different. And after a number of efforts to legislate Chinese and other immigrant groups out of the California and larger United States economy, the worst of it began or came into effect with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was, without doubt, federal and state-sponsored racism. This act excluded skilled and unskilled laborers and Chinese employed in mining from entering the United States. In Article 14 in 1884, this underwent a number of amendments. No state court or court of the United States shall admit Chinese to citizenship. This began 6 decades of institutionalized state and federal racism. And I have here the first and only Immigration Act. I've added a question mark here. I'll get to that at the end. To specifically target an ethnic or racial group from exclusion in the United States. This went on the books in 1882, became more and more harsh. It wasn't repealed until 1943. Absolutely a really ugly piece of our American history. All right. So with this sort of anti-Chinese movement, the Exclusion Act, there were also a number of different laws and acts, both in the state of California and in the larger United States, that really ended Chinese domination of the commercial abalone fishery. I can give you a lot of these, but just to save time, I mean, they were restricting ownership of Chinese junks. They're restricting re-entry into America. So if you went and visited someone in China, coming back was tenuous. If you went down to Baja to gather abalone, getting back into U.S. waters was tenuous. And so really all of this increased taxes, targeted taxes, really just ended Chinese involvement in this industry. And in terms of California Fish and Game, they pitched the ending of Chinese domination of this historical fishery as laws that were designed to save California abalone from, quote, thoroughgoing Chinamen with their usual lack of foresight. Right, so their position was Chinese immigrants were harvesting abalone with total disregard for the sustainability of the fishery. And we're doing this to save California abalone. All right? All right, so once the Chinese, some Chinese fishermen hung on really till about 1915, but starting in the 1870s with this anti-Chinese movement, really into the 1880s, Euro-Americans and other groups were recognizing all the money that was to be made from abalone fishing, and they wanted in. And so as Chinese involvement waned, Japanese and other Euro-American involvement increased, and what they did is not just gather intertidal black abalone, but they put together hard hat diving operations and went after subtidal abalone as well. So this is from that Point Bennett site. These are Japanese ceramics, probably from and this is a picture, we think, off of San Miguel Island, off of Point Bennett, of a Chinese hard hat diving outfit. And they were probably camping in right about the same spot Chinese fishermen were just probably a few years before. So Field and Stream, 1891, abalone are not common use among the Americans who do not understand the mode of preparing them. So even though Euro-Americans and other groups were entering into this commercial abalone fishing, Euro-Americans in California and in the American West weren't eating abalone. So it was still consumed by Chinese and other Asian immigrants in California and shipped off overseas. They just didn't have an appetite for it. Right, that all changed in 1915, and this was the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and that occurred in San Francisco. It was to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal, and just as a side, it finished 2 years early. Does that ever happen? This major construction event, right? So, and it was going to introduce the world to the delights of California: architecture, science, literature, and food. And they had a 1,300-seat dining hall with over 350 varieties of local California seafood. They produced a menu, and one of the things they served was abalone. And this was sort of the first introduction to Euro-Americans for, this is delicious, right? And so abalone didn't make it into the menu, but right after this, it started to, whoa, hold on, getting there. By 1915, I should say, 1913, 1915, abalone drying was outlawed. Yeah, so they started to can, right? And black abalone the fishery for black abalone was really tightened up and shut down, right? So canneries popped up. Chinese could no longer do business the way they were doing it, so they were essentially out at this point. And then right at the same time, we start to see abalone showing up on bills of fare in restaurants around the American West, in places like in California. So here's one of them. This is not very old. This is the best one I could find. But abalone chowder first appears. The first appearance is in 1916. Abalone steak, 1923. So for the first time, you could go to a restaurant and start to eat abalone. Mid-1920s, a fried abalone steak cost 60 cents. Those were the days, huh? $6.50 into today's currency, right? And so abalone started to develop this local market among Euro-Americans. And the Euro-American industry then really blossomed because of this increased consumption locally. And so by the 1920s, there was a really robust Euro-American harvest of abalone of all different species, subtidal species, and we started to see a general depletion of abalone, probably because of this increased fishing and the slow regrowth rates. And so we'd have the booms and busts cycles, right? So abalone available, overfishing is rampant, it disappears, people switch the economy to different things, it comes back, it repopulates, and it ramps up again. So here's the Pierce brothers in Santa Barbara, 1933, with this mountain of abalone shells, right? Be awesome to decorate your lawn with those. So one of the things I became really interested in doing this project was this getting rid of Chinese immigrants? Was it conservation or was it racism? Right? So the Board of Fish and Game Commissioners, 1910, the real purpose of the law is aimed at the aliens, Japanese and Chinese principally, who are taking them by the ton without regard to size. So we could actually test that. We could test that with the archaeological record. So here are sizes from 23 historical Chinese abalone fishing sites on the Channel Islands. So measuring the lengths of them, over 1,300 measurements, and this is how they play out from largest to smallest, right? And I've had them bend here in a certain way. Well, this means nothing to you. You're like, what is this? All right, so let me fill you in on a few details. This is 1910, 1911, minimum size limit 97 millimeters. Only 9.6 abalones collected during the Chinese industry that we have record of are below this limit. The mean during this time, or the mean is 125.8. Okay. Juvenile abalones, so non-reproducing black abalones, are considered anything under 50 millimeters. Only 2 juveniles were found in any Chinese historical site, 0.1%. Only 162, 11.7%, measured less than double the size of the smallest juvenile. So what does that sound like to you? That sounds like conservation to me, right? And that sounds like a strategy to leave small abalones, go after larger abalones, and then cycle back because you're gathering around the islands after a few years and you're always leaving a new harvest, right? 2 decades of Chinese harvest on these islands intensively, and we see no evidence of collapse. To me, that's conservation. And this shouldn't be surprising because there were customary laws in places like the Chinese shrimp fishing industry that said who can take what and how much. Right? So the Chinese were already doing this in other places in California, and they were probably doing it with the abalone industry. So, conservation or racism? I think you know my answer, right? It was part of this larger anti-Chinese movement in California. Well, let's keep going with this. these are the sizes of black abalone through 10,000 years on the Channel Islands, harvested by the Chumash for 10,000 years. These are the average sizes of black abalone from Chinese fishing sites. Now again, this is a continually harvested resources with otters in the system. It was a totally different system. But look at this. Absolutely fundamentally different than any harvest over 10,000 years. And one that, again, I think is one that points towards conservation. Now, I won't read this all to you. I'll sum it up. California basically said, now that we have these laws in place, we've gotten rid of the Japanese and Chinese harvest and these thoroughgoing Chinamen that are ruining the abalone. Abalone in California will last forever because we're protecting it and we've got it squared away, right? That's essentially right. It did last for a while, and we went through these boom and bust cycles, and the harvest of abalone ramped up through the 20th century with this Euro-American harvest, and it seemed sustainable for decades. But what was going on is essentially this is the different species of abalone and the takes. And what was essentially happening was you go after one species. When that species declines, you switch to a less desirable species of abalone, right? So that's called a serial collapse of abalone. And so that ended up being the problem. It looks sustainable, right? It looks like a period of sustainable harvest, but what you're doing is wiping one out and then adding something new in. And then eventually you get to a point where the entire system collapses because of rampant overfishing. And again, this is an economic problem. Just like those otter pelts, during the seemingly sustainable harvest, abalone are really cheap, right? As they disappear, the prices on those bills of fare just go up, and people go after more and more abalone, right? So by the 1980s and 1990s, you've probably heard a lot about this. This is a withering foot syndrome sweeps through California and the Pacific coast, wiping out abalone. This is a bacterial infection that essentially works on the digestive system of the abalone. It starts to eat itself. It falls off, withers, dies, right? So combined with overfishing and this new disease, the only place you can get commercial abalone is from a series of farms of tank-grown abalone in Central California. That's why it now costs you, what, $75 to have an abalone steak at a fancy restaurant here in San Diego, because they're being grown in tanks. Well, what is this? I told you, I know I'm running out of time. I told you we might be able to learn something about how to put this back together, how to put Humpty Dumpty back together from the archaeological record. Well, what's scary is that the commercial and sport fishery for black abalone has been closed since 1993. And in 2009, it was a species of concern in 1993, closed to all fishery. By 2009, it was only worse. And so it goes from a species of concern to an endangered species. Things have to be really bad, right? So is there something archaeology can tell us? Well, part of the abalone management plan in California was to do something called outplanting. You grow a bunch of black abalone, and I'm just going to talk about blacks. You grow a bunch of black abalones in tanks. You take those cute little juveniles, you let them go, and you're like, reproduce, right? And we send millions of these things out. They're supposed to repopulate coastlines and help jumpstart the population. Well, looking at where they're going to do this, right, in 2005, this was the part of the abalone management plan, that any place on San Miguel and 60% of Santa Rosa and any place on Anacapa are great places to outplant. And I thought, can't we do better than that? Is any place, like the whole coastline of these places, just as good as any other place? Well, we can use what's called the historical ecology approach to maybe narrow down these restoration baselines. So we can take all the data of commercial fishing, from 1950 to the closure in 1993, and we have that in the report, and we can put it up here, and I'll go quickly, right? Lots of black abalone were taken around San Miguel. The green is the next best spots, and then the gray are sort of marginal spots. Well, let's combine this commercial fishery with the prehistoric fishery. So these are all places that black abalone was harvested intensely by the Chumash. Let's take that and overlay that with the Chinese sites. Now what do we have? Well, what we have, I think, are hotspots where black abalone have been available. Here, I didn't show you this data, but on the southern islands too, for 10,000 years, black abalone have done really well in these spots. Through the Chumash harvest, through the Chinese harvest, through the modern harvest. Maybe we should outplant there first, right? A really simple message, but one that I think that archaeology can contribute to help solve this problem and perhaps restore the fishery for abalone. All right, so I want to conclude here and just, and I'll say a few things. This narrative of Chinese abalone fishing in Southern California, I think, is a broader analogy for the history of immigrants in America, their struggles, the hardships, the institutionalized racism they often face, and the many unique ways they reshaped our nation. And often their stories are relegated to a footnote in our history, right? Because at the time, they were marginalized and no one bothered to write those histories down. And so that's where archaeology can help celebrate what these immigrant communities offered our nation. And I would say, I don't want to get too political. I would say the story continues, though. We are on the precipice of making the same mistakes we made 130 years ago with exclusionary laws. I find this, despite your politics, something that has gone ongoing in our history. It's sort of part of human history to point fingers at the group that's different from you when things get difficult, right? The irony with Dennis Kearney was that in the 1830s, you could go past a business and you would often see Nina in the window. No Irish need apply, because they were the immigrant community that was ruining the country. Then it was the Chinese. Who is it now? I tell my students all the time, we need to learn from history. And I like to talk about this historical ecology and hotspots. If we can't learn this simple history, avoid the ugly exclusionary laws that we instituted in the 1880s and do the new version, man, we're in big trouble. So join the fight. And the key to restoring our degraded marine ecosystems and saving abalone from extinction may be by looking to the past. There's lots of stories. Doing archaeology isn't just cool because it's cool to learn about history. I really think there are things that we can apply to make the world better. So history matters, archaeology matters. There are lessons from deep history that we can apply today if we open our eyes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic talk. Thanks. I want a bumper sticker with Archaeology Matters on it. That's pretty cool. So now we're going to turn it over to a question and answer period. And again, I'll just say to wait until I come to you with the mic before asking your question.
Continuing the theme of what has happened over history, you talked that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943, mm-hmm. And my question is: during that time period in the 30s, Mexicans were shipped back to Mexico. 43 was during World War II, and that was the time we had the internment camps. Mm-hmm. How did that happen? That this was repealed? That it was with that spirit?
Yeah, there was just growing recognition that these were targeted racist laws. And you're right, despite the irony that these other groups were targeted, it just, by that time there were enough advocates, enough political advocates to finally remove it from the books. And it wasn't that no Chinese immigrant. I mean, there's a lot of. I've boiled it down very simply. I do a little bit better job of giving you the details in my book, but it wasn't that no one could come. Right? There were certain targeted groups like laborers, but there were other folks that could find their way, other Chinese immigrants that could find their way into the United States through sort of in special categories. But that coup de grace of like removing it from the books was finally just sort of enough political action and political weight to make it change. I don't know that I have a better explanation than that. Yeah.
At the beginning, you were talking about the otters, how they were hunted to near extinction in the Channel Islands. Well, today there really aren't otters out there. Is there any effort made to try and restore their population?
Yeah, so this is a really tough issue, and I talk with a lot of former commercial abalone fishermen and with park and sanctuary folks. And it's a really tough issue. So there has been a reintroduction in otters around San Nicolas Island. Part of the problem and one of the reasons that otters haven't been reintroduced to the Channel Islands and other places in California is because they're voracious predators of abalone, and we're worried, biologists, ecologists are worried about if abalone can recover with otter predation, with heavy otter predation. And so it's this balance between how do we restore abalone, how do we put otters back in the system, and when do we do these things? And so they are political landmines in many ways, and lots of people with lots of interests. But thankfully, I'm an archaeologist, and I don't need to figure that out. Because it's a really tough issue. And so there's lots of studies. Well, can abalone survive with otters, a recovering abalone population? Some studies have said yes. Other studies have said no. And so we're still trying to sort that out. But I think to restore the abalone fishery, we're going to have to rebalance the whole system. So we're going to have to. The idea that this commercial fishery, the Chinese commercial fishery, will ever be restored is a dream, right? It's a myth, because that fishery was one of dysfunction. Otters were wiped out. The ecosystem was totally dysfunctional. The sizes and abundance of abalone was unlike anything we'd seen in 10,000 years. So we're not going to restore that. But what we might be able to restore is otters in the system, a human harvest of abalone, and a balanced, healthy marine ecosystem. And like a local harvest of abalone that feeds a local market. We're not going to feed a global market with abalone in California.
Hey, quick question. I just wondered, was the industry alive in China and then it moved here, the abalone fishing industry?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I have this debate with some of the folks I work with, and one of my former students is, did Chinese immigrants come over intending to go into the fisheries, or did they come intending to go into Gold Mountain and then be pushed to the fisheries? I don't know that we know that for sure. But what we do know is there was a thriving abalone fishery in China that had been totally overfished, right? It undergone collapse really at the hands of overfishing. And so for me, that whole story about conservation, and like, I don't think it's a stretch to understand that these Chinese fishermen knew that the abalone fishery had collapsed in China, and it was one of their only economic options in California, right? Being pushed out of the gold industry, being marginalized from other industries, and they had to make it work. So I think they set about to govern themselves to keep it going, because it is a species that's slow growing, and if you go after everything, pretty quickly you can wipe out the population.
I was just wondering on the transport of the abalone to China. How did the Chinese on the mainland eat it? Was it the meat, or was it all dried, or was it salted, or did they have ice that could? How did they get ice out to the? I mean,
Yeah,
how did they
so
do that?
to ship it off, it was all dried. And this was, I mean, that's really essentially one of the reasons that Euro-Americans didn't have an appetite for abalone. There's historical newspaper accounts of folks trying abalone, and they're like, it is like shoe leather, right? I mean, this is like totally unappetizing. But the difference is, I mean, they rehydrated it and made it appetizing. There was just no menu. I mean, Euro-Americans at the time didn't know how to do that, didn't know how to make it appeasing. Like, you have to rehydrate it, you got to pound it out, you got to make it into something that's appetizing. And I mean, in all honesty, black abalone is a little less appealing than things like red abalone too, if anyone's had abalone. So yeah, so there are some differences between the species, but yeah, it was dried, but you have to do a lot of processing to make it edible. Yeah.
What replaced the abalone in the ecosystem along the coast?
Well, I was going to say, and this just came to mind, one of the reasons we haven't introduced otters as well is their impact on urchin fisheries. And so sea otters are not only voracious predators of abalone, but urchins and crabs and other things. So what replaced abalone? I don't know that I know that for sure. I would think things like turban snails and owl limpets and other sort of grazing animals like blacks in intertidal systems, but I don't know that I know that for sure, right? I think that's probably an ecologist question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So. Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I would assume it's things like black turban snails and owl limpets like things like intertidal black abalone would be competing with for space.
Oh, thank you. For the uninitiated, you described one of the artifacts as opium glass.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what exactly is opium glass, and
Sure.
how was it used, and how do you know it was opium glass?
Yeah. So, opium glass. So an opium lamp has sort of a tin at the bottom. You put your opium on it, and you light it, and then it has a glass with a hole in the middle, and the smoke comes up, and you have a pipe. And there's a picture in my book of this. You have the pipe, and then you would suck in the smoke from the pipe, right? So the glass is sort of the top of that, right? And we know it's opium glass because, I mean, it has a really distinctive hole in the top, and it has these kind of undulations on the top around that hole. So if we have opium lamps in comparative collections, we can take that glass that we found at a site on Santa Rosa, and it just matches perfect. The size, the shape, the sort of way it was made, I mean, it is just like a slam dunk. And so that's kind of how we identify artifacts in the archaeological record. We have comparative collections, and then we compare these fragments and see how well it matches. Yeah, that answers.
Probably have time for one more question here.
I was just telling my students, if I'm seeming like I'm hawking my book, I'm teaching this class called Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. And one of the things we do is deconstruct pseudo-archaeology. So we're talking about all these pseudo-archaeology books that have sold millions and millions of copies, and I just get so depressed, right? Like, my parents have bought my book, and that may be about it. My wife has yet to read it, Sorry.
That's okay. I was wondering, when you were doing your research, if you incorporated interviews with people who might have some sort of memory of the abalone, commercial abalone fishermen, and whether or not there's still sort of a cultural memory of the fishing.
So we've tried, and one of my students, Linda Benz, who just finished up at San Diego State with me, we've tried really hard to find relatives, ancestors, folks who had abalone fishermen, Chinese abalone fishermen in their families. And we've been largely unsuccessful. Her plan is to go back to China, Guangdong province, and try to trace it all the way back to China, which would be really cool. What I do is I talk to a lot of commercial, former commercial abalone fishermen who are around, and many of them are urchin fishermen now. And I talk a lot with them about this work. And they have all this knowledge about the ecology and biology of abalone and the history of the fishery, and their perspective on why it collapsed and what happened. And I boiled it down in here, but it's a really complicated story that it is really difficult to sort out. But I think a lot of scientists don't talk to folks like commercial fishermen. I find them to be an exceptionally valuable resource, and one that we shouldn't overlook. Right? But finding the descendants of Chinese abalone fishermen in Santa Barbara would just be awesome. But the reality was, probably at the height of the fishery, there were probably 25 or so abalone fishermen working the Northern Islands, right? So it's a small group.
Awesome. Well, please join me again in thanking Todd for coming tonight. It was a great talk.